Hello everybody, this is Chet Roberts, and now we'll be talking about the understanding students with ADHD. Before we move forward, a couple notes. So I apologize, I've been under the weather for the last 3 or 4 days, so this is now my 8th take of this, so if I clear my throat a lot or anything like that, that's most likely the reason. The second note is that I actually have a child with ADHD. So I'll be a little biased on some of the subjects. I know we're not supposed to use any personal notes, but it'll be kind of hard not to draw some comparisons. So I kind of want to put that one going forward. So with that said, kind of going through the questions. First of all, how many students in the United States are dealing with ADHD, or how many children? So an interesting fact that I found is it's estimated about 9.4% of the child population is diagnosed with ADHD. And try not to read through every slide word for word here. I was fond of the idea that they break it into different age groups. So 2 through 5, 6 through 11, 12 through 17. And you see here the numbers are relatively close in the upper age groups. And the younger one, as expected, to be a little smaller. It's hard to communicate with a 2-year-old, asking them how they feel or how they handle certain situations. So you see here it kind of jumped from 388,000 to that 3-4 million range, and collectively about a 7.3 million. One interesting fact that I noticed, probably more than anything, is the fact that boys are more than twice as likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. So I come from a large family. I had about 5 younger sisters. I have children of my own, like I said, so I have 2 boys and 1 girl. And I know they always say that boys have a harder time paying attention compared to girls. And that's not really anything to do with ADHD, but to see that here in this stat is something that I find quite interesting. So, in comparison over the years, how has this number trended, specifically in recent years? And I found it quite puzzling to see the fact that it has trended continuously upwards pretty much since the time it's been measured. And usually when I make these slides, I typically don't break the template. I'm a stickler. I work in marketing. But this one I had to blow up just a little bit so you can see it. And you can see it goes from 1997 to 2017. So about a 20-year range. And as you can see, starting from the left to the right, it does in fact trend upwards. And the multiple colors represent multiple age groups in the ways it was measured, or the actual survey poll that measured it. What I find probably the most interesting or fascinating is the 4 to 17 blue color line is relatively shortly measured. Was started after the fact the measurements began and then stopped midway too. This kind of shows a redesign of the measurements as a whole. So why the trend is probably the biggest question. There's much speculation to this. So kind of like any condition or any disease, the way we measure the condition, the way we treat it, the way we diagnose it, the way you survey it, the way you do everything regarding it is continuously changing. It's a relatively young field, so we're trying to find our way here. So it's not necessary that more children have ADHD. It might be simply our techniques have improved to where we're actually diagnosing the children correctly, and it's a trend that we've noticed throughout society. So as this develops and more data is collected, more years and more time passes by, I'm interested to see how this is impacted with some of the decisions made on a larger scale. So I found it kind of funny that these two questions interacted with each other, but I did want to separate them, and I used probably one of the most famous internet memes here, and I'll get to the graph that's between the hands in a minute. But I can't stress enough, this condition, it was first described in the year 1902, okay? The automobile was tested most likely before this, the earlier stages, before this condition was even found, right? The telegraph is older than this condition. There are train systems older than this system. We have fought, many battles over other conditions before this one was even described. So even though being over 100 years old, we just don't know much about it. And probably everything we do has been learned more in the last 50 years than the entire over 100 years that it's been represented. To kind of demonstrate this, I found this interesting graphic. We're not going to go through all of it, but I just wanted to show you kind of the scale and scope of things. So the top left-hand corner kind of shows you the initial research, 1902, 1923, the early years of its diagnosis. On the bottom, you kind of see the medications that are associated with, or the treatment plans. You see in the 1990s, Adderall, probably the most associated medication with the cause or the situation. But if you see the largest amount of grouping between 1990s and the 2010s, very little before that. That's a huge gap. I mean, if you even look at the research portion of it, there's almost nothing in the 1940s. Now, granted, we were going through a major world war at that time, on the global scale, and there was probably other things to attend to. But over 100 years, this is what we have. So it is something we're still learning from. So what are the things we do know? So we know about the behaviors and characteristics of ADHD, and there's kind of two categories here. There's the inattention version of the symptoms and the hyperactivity. And this is kind of where I draw the comparison to my son. So it's not an either or. You can actually have both. So for instance, my son, definitely hyperactive. He's about 9 years old, good kid. Because of his hyperactivity, he has trouble paying attention. So he's easily distracted, but yet when he's around the right distractions, he can also talk excessively. He has trouble staying organized. While he's also fidgeting and he's got the energy, he interrupts others. It's not that he's purposely doing it, it's just he can't control it. Probably the largest one for him is failing to give close attention to the details. And I don't know if there's any science behind this, but I find it's kind of subject-based. So for instance, he's very numbers-driven. So if you give him a math problem or you put him in a math class, he tends to pay more attention than if you put him in a reading class. And likewise, if you put him in a basketball game, he's all over the place. He's almost impossible to coach at first if you don't know about him. Yet you give him a bow and an arrow and you teach him archery and it requires discipline and it's one-on-one time. It's like magic. So having these symptoms can fall on both sides of the scale. Also the severity. So for instance, we have a child here in our subdivision. He actually lives about 2 doors down. He too has ADHD, and it's a completely different scenario. Not for good or bad. He is also hyperactive and has inattention, but he does it in different ways compared to my son. So because of this, there's numerous issues of how you diagnose it, how do you see it, how do you handle it. So that goes to our next question. How does it impact learning and participation in school? And of all the fancy graphics and all the paragraphs that I put in here and work citations, I think the pie chart explains it best. When you think about school, it's really down to 3 things: communicating, concentrating, memorizing. If you have the hyperactivity or your inattention to the details because you lack concentration, it's hard to communicate what you remember if you can't focus on it. It's simple as that. And the scary part of ADHD is in numerous cases not be noticed for a severe amount of time for a child. So if you don't catch on early and let's say go through kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and it's like, okay, that's just how that individual is. And then they go into 3rd and 4th grade and you finally diagnose it. There are habits that have already been created. There are missed opportunities that have been identified, and now you're playing catch up. So early diagnosis, in my mind, is a high way to do it. So fortunately, we were able to diagnose it pretty quick. Then like the second week of his kindergarten year, we noticed real quick that there was a problem. Constant letters from the teacher, situations with other students, just real trouble focusing on things. And once we were able to attack those scenarios, he's able to actually produce in school and learn. We still have our moments, don't get me wrong, but because of the early detection, you can see a big difference. So, do all students with ADHD demonstrate the same characteristics or degree of behavior? Flat out, no. I bring back the scenario of the child down the street. It's a completely different ball game. There are subjects that he can pay attention to compared to subjects my son can pay attention to. The way he handles the certain reactions compared to our reactions. It's really a case-by-case basis, and this is what makes it particularly hard to diagnose and treat. So, according to the IDEA of 2004, how is ADHD handled? And I'll admit, through all my research, there was a sentence that underlined the word "not" when it was associated with the learning disability, and I kind of stole that format. But I want to stress enough, ADHD is not considered a learning disability. You may have to work around it, work with it, but it does not prohibit the ability to learn. You just have to learn probably in a different way. At least that's my experience with it. It is considered a disability as a whole through the IDEA. Therefore, a student is eligible for special education services, but it's classified as an other health impaired category. And there's a different coping methods compared to someone else that has the inability to learn through other situations. So, big stress there. IDEA has went great lengths to identify this into its own category. So, how can a class, intervene or create an intervention for this? I'm not going to go through every single one of these. These are just examples. But I think anticipating the needs of the student probably should be number 1 on the list. I'm actually ashamed I put it number 2. These aren't in particular order, but I definitely feel like that should be in the top left. Providing instructions up front, deconstructing the task, making it simple, keeping the duration of each task down to a minimum, and honestly just staying organized. I walk into classrooms and I walk into business places and I see a trend. Organization is the key. If you're organized, the student will recognize it and they'll stay organized. Now my son is very, very competitive. He has an older sister. I remember when he was younger, she would come home, work on her, her addition and her subtraction. Here he is a grade or 2 below her. And he took offense to the fact that his sister would learn things before him. So he actually stole her math book one night, or every night really, and was teaching himself how to do math. That's how competitive he was. But yet, when you go to the classroom, he can't sit still during reading. So gamification is a great way to do that. Introduce, timers or reward the work, some way to get the student to relate to the work. And you see here there are various other methods. So for all the projects I've ever done for this class, this is probably definitely have the most works cited, and I highly suggest reading through as many as you can. I was overwhelmed by the information that there is, and startled at the fact of how very little we know at the same time. So definitely look at us. I think from an education standpoint, it opens my eyes of how to handle a student in a group, and I truly appreciated the assignment. Thank you.